Now, last but not least is our cognitive and / language programs. All of these interventions are based on scaffolding theory, and that is the idea that children all have what we call a zone of potential development of when they can best learn certain things. So, for example, if you're thinking about teaching a child to tie his or her shoelaces, you probably wouldn't do this when they're 2. This is because they won't have the attention span to remember the sequence, nor will they have the fine motor skills to do it. However, a 4-year-old is probably at a good age to learn. But most of us who have done this, you don't just tie the shoes for them and say, Bob's your uncle, there, you're done. What you do is you break it down into achievable steps for them so that they can see the salient features and learn what needs to be learned, and also achieve a sense of mastery. You know, when you first loop those 2 things, that's actually an important step, and doing it tight enough is a really important step. For the kids to see that they can do that and get cheered on by the parent or the adult scaffolding, that's very important. That's a very important part of the process. And some parents do this naturally, whereas others have difficulty doing this. And just to go, again, we'll go back to she's my second cousin. And I'm just going to show you this about how this takes place naturally in a child's environment. It's not always the parents who do the scaffolding.
You're not my sister, I'm your sister. I'm your brother. No, you're not my brother. Big people turn into brothers. And I'm not your brother. You're not my brother. No, you're my sister. No, you're not my sister. You're not my sister. I'm your sister. I'm his. No. No, you're not my sister. I'm your sister. You're making me so tired, Kelly. I don't want to talk to you.
Already she's figured something isn't quite right. But it is that questioning that makes the difference, okay? And this happens naturally in middle and upper middle and professional income families. They're very language-rich environments. There's a lot of talking going on. Some people have called this the 30 million word gap. And I have the graph on the side here. It's showing here that in middle income families, that an average 3-year-old has 1,116 words, whereas in low-income families, they have 525 words. That's the vocabulary. And this is partially a difference in terms of the amount of language that they hear, the number of words they hear, the number of different words that they hear, but that's not enough. It's the context in which they have learned it. And this is an important point that I think that the jury is not out at yet. Is it volume or quality or both? And I think it's both. So there are some interventions out there that try to teach children vocabulary, and scientists are skeptical about some of these. It's about the context in which the vocabulary is learned. So it's about that questioning and answering and the sorts of things that you saw going on in that video. She knows that she's not a brother. She's not quite sure what brothers do because there are no brothers in her house. So she's asking the right questions, and she knows that her sister's giving her the wrong answer. Her sister doesn't have it right either. But she's thinking about the concept, and through that process, she will get it right. And I can tell you, her parents straightened her out in the end. She knows that they're not calling her brother. This is all dead clear now. And it's that process that makes a difference in their learning. And I hope you can see too, it's not just about the number of words. It is the concepts underpinning the words. And we're seeing now this 30 million word gap is present in the original Hart and Ritzley study in 1995. We're finding significant differences between low-income and middle-income children already at 18 months, and has to do with the language-rich environment that they grow up in. And this also means that there are no quick fixes here. Unfortunately, we only looked at 20 interventions that aimed to improve children's early language and cognitive development. We think that this is because there were some issues with the search terms in the original study, so some of them weren't identified, but also because a lot of activity in this area doesn't take place in terms of parent-child interaction. It takes place in terms of interventions that are delivered by speech and language therapists or potentially preschool. So that would be another reason why it was out of scope. But I'm saying that, I'm highlighting now because there are probably many things out there that we just didn't identify. Of the 20, we found 2 that had evidence of improving child outcomes. Both of these interventions were home visiting interventions delivered by teachers lasting for a year or longer. And just to point out from some of the attachment interventions and then a third one that I'm going to describe in a minute, there are actually 3 additional home visiting interventions that also appear to make a difference that weren't in that part of the assessment, but just highlighting that there are multiple ways of improving children's early language development. But all of them in this assessment tend to be intensive interventions given to families where there's pre-identified social disadvantage. One of these is a program that was developed in the UK. It's called Let's Play in Tandem. It was developed to be delivered through Sure Start Children's Centers. This intervention, in fact, is offered to children who are aged 3 and older, and the parents are visited once a week by a certified teacher. This lasts for a year, and the intervention has some very nice outcomes on a variety of cognitive scales, as well as behaviors that we call the executive functions, children's ability to plan when doing complex tasks, sit still, and also in terms of children's behavior. And interestingly, though, it's delivered when children are 3, and our evidence is suggesting that maybe some things should take place even before the ages of 3. The second one is that program that I mentioned at the beginning that had undergone 5 RCTs, the first 4 of which showed no effect. This is Parents as First Teacher. It's also available in the UK. However, the majority of its evidence is in the United States. It was developed in the 80s. It was in widespread use before it underwent its first RCT, and that study was very disappointing. The one that followed was even worse because it showed that actually things got worse for some of the participants in the program. And in fact, many people said it should be scrapped, but because it was already in such high widespread use, people said, no, we really need to fix this. One of the things that they did to fix it was to increase the training and the consistency of the training around the practitioners and their supervision, as well as come up with a much better manual. So then they had, and in that time there was a 3rd evaluation that was also not very positive, but then there was a 4th one, and the results were not particularly good, but they did show some improvements in children's mastery motivation. And this was just published in 2009. In the meantime, the Swiss government had heard about the program, and they had not heard about the disappointing findings. And in the canton of Zurich, they decided to implement it to all of their most disadvantaged families and found out about the bad evidence afterwards. But they did a couple of things that were different because already they had it invested. First of all, it was delivered by health visitors there that are highly trained and supervised. And I was quite surprised to find out that a health visitor in Zurich makes the equivalent of 100,000 pounds per year. So this is a highly supervised population. Yeah, I think we should all try to move to Switzerland and become health visitors. The second thing is they made sure that the program was highly targeted to the most disadvantaged families who needed it the most. And they took great efforts to make sure that they contacted those families and that they were retained in the program. They had very high retention rates in the beginning. And when it was delivered that way, they had consistent improvements in children's language at every point with the Bailey scales. And when the intervention was over, there was also improvements in the children's behavior. Interestingly, no improvements in the attachment relationship, but that's not what the intervention was set out to do. So it was for us, because these findings were published as we were doing the review, it was like the phoenix rising out of the ashes. And it is an example of how interventions can go back and again to the drawing board and get it right. It's also an example of how important implementation is, fidelity to the model, and making sure that your staff is well supervised, and all the other things that I showed you in principle number 6. The Canton of Zurich took all of those things into account before they rolled it out. So just to summarize a few messages here. Firstly, we did not find very many evidence-based interventions. We only found 17. But we feel, nevertheless, that they offer some interesting and good choices for people looking for evidence-based programs to put in their suite of services for young children. The choice is greatest amongst interventions that target children's behavior, age 3 and older, and it's the least, actually, I say here, attachment, but also it is in these interventions for younger children and targeting their language. And that some interventions are quite expensive, but those interventions tend to still provide value for money because they're dealing with very serious, costly problems, and also that many of those interventions in the price includes ongoing consultation from the provider to help install it, so you don't have to figure that out on your own as commissioners. And I will just finish then with what we would call a portfolio of interventions and how they might spread. I know it's difficult to see here, but if you look at your slide packs back at home, where these interventions might be offered, or where and when, in terms of your children's services. So that's all I have to say. I'd like to turn it over to you if you to hear your questions and get any feedback.
Thank you very, very much, Kirsty.